A rancher is killed in southern New Mexico. Horse thieves, coming from the south, were after his gun and mule. They took him by surprise. A day later, the body is discovered. Word travels fast by radio and Apache forms, tracking the group as they ride on fresh horses to southern Arizona. This is rugged country. They have to travel as the raiders do. No adequate roads exist for cars to make it through the mountains. A story published from the Silver City Enterprise expresses the frustration of the locals. Quote, "A season has not passed when some citizens of Grant County have not lost their lives to this band of cutthroats." End quote. As the posse gets closer to the criminals, they find warm campfires and materials dropped by the fleeing raiders to lighten the loads of the horses. The posse tries to cut off the horse thieves before they can dive back into Mexico, but they're too late. Just as they reach the last ridge before the border, some of the posse see them on horseback before they escape. 8 of them. They are Apache. The year is 1924. Welcome to Dates and Dead Guys. The opening describes an Apache raid in 1924. Think about that for a second. Cars and radios existed. Babies born after World War I could be as old as 5, and there were still Apache roaming the mountains of the Southwest. There are people living today who were alive in 1924. Not a lot, but some. The Apache were able to exist off-reservation far longer than most people would believe. It's because they were possibly the most elusive people in world history. And today, I'm going to share with you 3 stories to help explain how that was possible. But before we get started here, if you are new to the channel, I research historical topics I find interesting and explain them in a story format. If that is your kind of thing, subscribe or leave a like and hopefully I can keep building the channel. I release a video or 2 a month, so be sure to come back for more content. We need just a little bit of context on the Apache so that these stories make sense. The Apache were raiders and nomads, broken into several bands. They inhabited the areas of modern-day Arizona, New Mexico, and northwest Mexico in the Sierra Madre Occidental Mountains. The United States was a little bit late to the scene heading west, so a lot of the earliest known contacts are between the Apache and the Mexicans. They didn't go well. There was lots of murder. That's actually where the Apache got their name. The Spanish adapted the word from the neighboring Zuni tribe. Their word for them was Apache, meaning enemy, and relations between the Mexicans and the Apache will live up to that moniker. There are reasons for the contentious relationship. The biggest is cultural differences. Mexico wanted the Apache to adapt to mainstream society, but the Apache didn't like the idea of toiling away as farmers and laborers. They were raiders. It was a way of life. When an Apache needed things like materials or horses, they got a war party together and they took them. But we all know what happens to horse thieves in the West. For added drama, it wasn't just horses and supplies they would take. Sometimes they would also kidnap people to ransom off, adopt, or torture to death. Many people would say that was also bad. To the Apache, the raids were not even necessarily about animosity. They were about subsistence. The region they lived in didn't provide much. It was hard country, arid and hot and mountainous, rattlesnakes fucking everywhere. If your people needed something, a way to get it was to take it from others. People will, however, get protective of their things, so sometimes people die. These societies in the 1800s, both Apache and Mexican, didn't exactly have strong and effective political institutions to arbitrate their disputes. So people do it, and that often creates blood feuds. You stole our horses and killed our brother? Now we're going to burn your village and kill your family. The path to escalation is obvious, and the cycle of violence will last in notable ways into the 1880s and in less obvious ways far longer. This type of lifestyle does develop a skill set and character that is unique, the kind that makes it possible to survive and hold out longer than any other tribe. And that's where we get to our stories. The Apache were experts of their environment. They knew everything around them to forage and were so familiar with their territory that they knew every watering hole and every cave available to them. Their skills made them difficult to find, and these mountains provide a lot of cover. When armies were coming to Apache lands, finding them was always an issue. The US military would literally often have to hire Apache scouts just to relay messages back and forth to different bands in the area. They were experts in stealth. The Apache would dress very simply. It's not the way we picture groups like the Lakota with massive feathered headdresses. And when they needed to be stealthy, They would often strip down to a breechcloth and moccasins, taking off their shirt because their skin would serve as better camouflage against the red and brown earth. John Cremeny wrote a book in 1868 called Life Among the Apaches, and although he never truly lived with them, the guy is about as legit as you could be at the time. He is likely the first white man to speak the language, and he spent an incredible amount of time with them. He witnessed something that's hard to believe, and recounts a story of an Apache that literally disappeared right next to him. Quote, "While crossing an extensive prairie, dotted here and there by a few shrubs and diminutive bushes, Quick Killer volunteered, while resting at noon, to show me with what dexterity an Apache could conceal himself, even where no special opportunity existed for such concealment. The offer was readily accepted, and we proceeded a short distance until we came to a small bush, hardly sufficient to hide a hair. Taking his stand behind this bush, he said, 'Turn your back and wait until I give the signal.' This proposition did not exactly suit my ideas of Apache character, and I said no. I will walk forward until you tell me to stop. This was agreed upon, and quietly drawing my pistol, keeping a furtive glance over my shoulder, I advanced, but had not gone 10 steps when Quick Killer hailed me to stop and find him. I returned to the bush, went around it 3 or 4 times, looked in every direction. There was no possible covert in sight. The prairie was smooth and unbroken. It seemed as if the earth had opened and swallowed up the man. Being unable to discover him, I called and bade him to come forth, when to my extreme surprise he arose, laughing and rejoiced, within 2 feet of the position I then occupied. With incredible activity and skill, he had completely buried himself under the thick grama grass within 6 feet of the bush, and had covered himself with such dexterity that one might have trodden upon him without discovering his person. I took no pains to conceal my astonishment and admiration, which delighted him exceedingly, and he informed me that their children were practiced regularly in this game of hide and seek until they became perfect adepts." End quote. It sounds impossible, but is it really? People can hide in plain sight. Animals do it all the time. I'll show you. There is a tiger in this picture. It's on the screen right in front of you. Can you see it? Found it. It's hard to imagine a people that can hide like that, but Cremeny says they could. General George Crook, an Indian hunter who will come this close to catching Geronimo in our 3rd story, famously described the Apaches as having an acuteness of sense, perfect physical condition, absolute knowledge of locality, and an absolute ability to persevere from danger. Crook added, quote, "We have before us the tiger of the human species." End quote. Think of what you saw in the video with the tiger and the story you just heard. The Apache are everything an apex predator needs to be, and into the 1860s, they're going to be backed into a corner. Relationships between the Americans and the Apache, specifically the Chiricahua, one of the bands, are going to take a bad turn in 1861. By the time of the Mexican-American War, the Apache had already been fighting Mexicans for many moons, but the Americans were new to the scene. They had to kill a lot of people to make it that far west, but the process was expedited when they found gold. The story played out in a familiar sense. Mexico claimed land occupied by the Apache, and they were like, hey, we live here. And then the American take that territory, including where the Apache live, and again, they are left like, who the hell are these guys? Regardless, the Americans and the Apache get along pretty well for a while, until in 1861 when a little white boy goes missing. The Chiricahua had a chief named Cochise. He was called to meet Lieutenant George Bascom in regard to a young boy, Felix Ward, who had been taken in a raid. Bascom believed the Chiricahua took the boy, but they didn't. It was actually Apaches though, but White Mountain Apaches, not the Chiricahua. But that didn't stop Bascom from getting overly aggressive and effectively taking Cochise and several of his family members as prisoners. That didn't go well. Cochise was in a tent with Bascom, and when it was made clear to him through a translator that he was in fact a prisoner, he wasn't having it, and he pulled a knife that he had concealed and instantly cut his way out of the tent they were in, sprinting into the surrounding wilderness. Cochise escapes, but unfortunately his family was not as lucky. For leverage, Cochise captured some Americans in order to exchange them for his family. Bascom, however, refused the trade, demanding that the boy, Felix Ward, be returned. I will remind you that the Chiricahua never had the boy. Cochise fled to Mexico, outside the jurisdictions of the Americans, but before he did, he tortured his 3 prisoners to death and left them for Bascom to find. Bascom will in return hang his Chiricahua captives, some of them family members of Cochise. This event is commonly called the Bascom Affair. It will lead to conflict between the Americans and Apache for decades. It probably helped the Apache that the Civil War was going on. The United States was distracted, but Cochise was able to continue raiding, and he avoided capture until 1872. During that time, he and his people held up in the Dragoon Mountains, using the natural resources and natural cover to avoid the military. They would move around and conduct raids in nearby areas. With few exceptions, they avoided pitched battles and stayed hidden, relying on covert actions. Cremini, in his book, compared the behavior of the Americans to the Apache during this time. He was an Apache, but in this section he writes as if it's them talking. Quote, "The Americans are brave, but they lack astuteness. They build a great fire which throws out so much heat that they cannot approach it to warm themselves. When they hear a gun fired, they are absurd enough to rush to the spot. But it is not so with us. We build small fires in secluded nooks which cannot be seen by persons unless close by, and we gather near to them so as to obtain the warmth. And when we hear a gun fired, we get away as soon as possible to some place from which we can ascertain the cause." End quote. He goes on to explain that the Apache, quote, "regard our daring as folly, and think discretion the better part of valor." End quote. That says a lot toward their values and their thought process toward conflict. The Apache were aggressive, but not reckless. Additionally, the land was hard, but the Apache could stay there because they knew the natural environment so well. They knew how to get meat and what plants to eat, including sunflower, weed seed, wild grasses, wild onions, fruit of cactuses, berries, and nuts. Paul Hutton wrote a book called Apache Wars. In it he says, quote, "It was a land where every plant bore a barb, every insect a stinger, every bird a talon, every reptile a fang. An inhospitable, deadly environment known to the outside world as Apacheria." End quote. But up in those mountains, the Apache could thrive, only coming out when they meant to take supplies that they needed. That part, however, the raiding, is what is going to keep the military on their back. The Apache Wars ended in 1886 with the surrender of Geronimo. If you don't know, Geronimo isn't just a funny word you say when you jump from a high surface. He was a medicine man and a warrior who will elude capture for much of his adult life. He's a Chiricahua, but one that his own people and maybe even the army believed had supernatural powers. As a young man, his wife and several of his children were viciously murdered by Mexican soldiers. As the story goes, after he found them, he heard the voice of Usan, a god, who told him that he will never die in battle, nor will he die by gun, and that the god will guide his arrows. I've always wondered how many made that claim, and no one talks about them because it turns out that they were wrong. He was also supposed to be able to see faraway events as they happened, and his people say that one time he kept the sun from coming up an extra few hours. All useful skills when you are fighting people your whole life and evading capture. Regardless of supernatural ability, the man was respected by his people and had a reason to distrust outside governments. But like much of the Chiricahua, he will resign to life on reservation for a time. When the Chiricahua agreed to live on reservation, they were promised a large chunk of land in their home territory, but they were moved to the San Carlos Reservation rather quickly. That place led to a lot of trouble. It wasn't what the Chiricahua were promised, and the area was hot and the soil was not good for farming. Disease was also a problem, as was getting the booze they wanted. Many did not want to stay there. Geronimo led his people in breakouts, 3 separate times in 1878, 1881, and 1885. Each time he would travel with a group that, like him, wished for their former nomadic lifestyle. They would flee Arizona and New Mexico and travel south to the Sierra Madre Occidental Mountains in Mexico. During the breakouts, the Apache would raid, steal, and kill people from the southern parts of the United States, as well as the Mexican states of Sonora and Chihuahua. Naturally, the Mexican and American governments are going to push back on that a little bit. In Geronimo's last escape, he was on the run with a little over 130 people. Famously, a quarter of the U.S. military was used to try to capture him. 5,000 troops. An additional 3,000 Mexican troops were helping, as well as over 100 hired Apache scouts. Literal Apache hunting Apache. Mexico had a vested interest in stopping him, as it was alleged that during that year and a half he was on the run, his people may have killed hundreds of Mexicans. He was pursued all year, relentlessly, traveling back and forth between Mexico and the United States, raiding as they go for supplies. One of the reasons the Apache were so hard to catch was that on horseback they could travel as many as 70 miles in a day in rugged terrain. They would literally run their horses to death, butcher them for their meat, and then steal more horses and then do it again. Geronimo was almost caught in January of 1886. U.S. Captain Emmett Crawford led a group that located and captured Geronimo's materials and horses. Geronimo, with nowhere to go, was set to surrender. But at the last minute, Mexican forces, also looking for Geronimo, happened upon the hired Apache scouts. They were helping the Americans search for Geronimo's group. The Mexicans attacked the scouts, thinking they are with Geronimo, or perhaps they're just trying to cash in on a scout bounty provided by the Mexican government, but a battle ensues. Crawford himself is killed, and Geronimo is able to escape. Just a few months later, in March 1886, General George Crook, from the Tiger quote, caught up with him again and negotiated Geronimo's surrender. There is a literal picture of this meeting, which is just incredible. Geronimo was getting boxed in, and he had been on the run for a long time. But before his final agreement, soldiers selling whiskey to the Apache may have told them that if they crossed the border into the United States, there were plans to kill him. So instead of doing that, Geronimo and 39 of his people escaped in the middle of the night. This time, those remaining made it till September, when after a full year and a half of constant pursuit, Geronimo finally surrendered for real. They made it a full year and a half, with thousands of people looking for him. That's how elusive and resourceful these people were. This time, when Geronimo was caught, the Americans didn't send him back to Reservation. They sent him to the worst place imaginable, Florida. If you like Florida now, that's great, but they didn't have air conditioning back then, and I bet you don't let your grandma swim near the Everglades. Geronimo won't be there forever. He'll be moved from time to time, but he's effectively held captive for the rest of his life. Largely because there was real fear that releasing him would mean more rebellions and violence. He does meet Teddy Roosevelt, though. I opened this episode on an Apache raid from 1924. We didn't get all the way to 1924, and this episode is long enough, so we're going to find a place to stop. Even though Geronimo was captured in 1886, not all of the Apache were. Some escaped reservations and returned to their resourceful life in the mountains, raids and all. The 1924 attack was the last recorded Apache raid in the United States, but there are records of raids in Mexico into the 1930s, and some serious claim that the Apache lived in those mountains until the 1950s. There are a lot more stories that show just how capable and elusive the Apache were, but there's a comment section below. Let me know if you want to hear some more. Thanks for watching the video. I hope that you enjoyed it and you come back to check out some of the other ones on the channel. If you have any questions, comments, or ideas for future videos, please send them in, and we'll hopefully get to all those.